Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 142. I'm speaking with Kat Evans. This is the third and final part of this episode, as we actually have spanned this over a couple episodes. So let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
All right, so welcome to a brand new episode. As I mentioned in the introduction, Kat's been on the podcast before. We actually did a three-part episode. In other words, I decided to break this up a little bit just because we did a very lengthy episode. We got into a lot of really great stuff. One of the key things was discussing women in visual effects, which I think is a really important subject and one that Kat obviously has a lot of experience in, but also just in general, being able to talk a little bit about the imbalances with it. And I think some of the changes that are happening, getting to see a bit more balance starting to happen, but still not quite there. But it was really cool to discuss that subject, as well as one which is kind of new, which was her exiting the industry. So exiting out of visual effects, which I think is something that doesn't really get talked about too often. I think that a lot of us will work for 10, 15 years usually, and then there is going to be a little bit of what's next, just because the hours can be very demanding in visual effects, and especially right now, there can be a little bit of an imbalance in terms of the expectations of people, especially work going to other countries, and sometimes you are expected to have to chase the work. So in other words, go to Vancouver or go to Montreal, go wherever the work is, and so I mean, there's been a lot of really great stuff that we got into, and I wanted these episodes to be very super specific, and so I broke this up into 3 episodes. And so this episode is more talking about Kat's history, her career, all the big movies that she's worked on, a lot of really great information, as well as a lot of insights that she shares as well. So I think there's a lot to benefit from this episode, and I'm really excited to get into it. One thing I did want to mention is that I've got some brand new high-end visual effects training that has been out for a couple of weeks, and it's only available for one more week. So it's only available till June 8th, and then it's getting locked away in the vault. So this is a new visual effects training series that I put together. It's free. It's over 10 hours. It goes through creating a high-end visual effects production shot from start to finish, going through the entire process. I think it's going to be really cool getting into it. This is something that I had a lot of people suggesting, and then we voted on different ideas, and this is the one that won, and I decided to go through and do it. So there's lots that we get into. I'm going to leave it there, though. I want to get into this episode. Couple of things. If you want to get that training, go to alanmckay.com/energyball, and you'll be able to get it there. I'll leave a link in the show notes as well. So the show notes for this episode are alanmckay.com/142, so episode 142, as well as there you'll be able to get quotes of everything that Kat and I say, as well as a lot of really key insights, a lot of really great information that she shared, a lot of the resources, links to everything that we talk about, everything to do with this episode and more will be all there. So go to alanmckay.com/142. Okay, so that is it. Let's dive in. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kat Evans, and for the past 14 years, I've worked in the visual effects industry. I started out as a Roto Paint Artist, and then I moved into match moving and camera layout, and I've worked for ILM and Tippett Studio and Giant Killer Robots and The Orphanage. I've worked on movies like Transformers, and I worked on the Iron Man franchise, so I've done a lot.
Yep, absolutely. No, that's awesome. And well, do you want to talk a little bit about how you got started? Because again, I feel like everyone's journey is a little bit different. And I was talking with someone last night who was actually a sommelier, like a wine expert for 10 years, and then decided that he loved doing art and quit his career and got into doing film. So I mean, everyone's got a bit of a different past. And for you, like, did you always want to be a artist growing up, or did you fall into it in a later date?
Yeah, I loved art growing up as a kid. I did a lot of drawing and painting and took all the art classes in school. And I was on track to being an art teacher, actually. And I was working as an art teacher in the public schools in upstate New York. And then that was right around the time that two significant movies came out. One was Toy Story, and the other was Jurassic Park. And I saw particularly Jurassic Park, and I just said, I have to do that. I have to know how that's done. I was absolutely fascinated. And in New York, they required teachers to get a master's degree. And so I was facing having to go back to school anyway to get a master's. And I said, why don't I just get a master's in computer graphics?
I like it.
So that's kind of how I got on the path of doing visual effects.
That's cool. And I guess in the very beginning, did you, you just went back to school and kind of studied that? Like, did you instantly graduate from school and be like, all right, great, now go into the industry? Or, was it a bit of lead up time to kind of get in there?
So I was a student at Savannah College of Art and Design, and I actually graduated, and then they took me on as a faculty member for a little while. And that was a great experience. It enabled me to finish a short film that I was working on, and it kind of gave me a little time to kind of get my head on straight. But then I said, this isn't what I really came here for, and this is a great opportunity, and it meant a lot that they wanted me to teach for them.
You're like, I want to go make dinosaurs.
Exactly. Exactly. So I had a friend, so I left Savannah, and I had a friend working for Kleiser Walzak in Massachusetts, and they were working on X-Men 2. The thing they really needed help with was Rebecca Romaine Stamos, that was her name at the time, before she divorced John Stamos. She refused to wear prosthetic contacts for that film. And so we needed to track her eyes and make her eyes yellow as Mystique. And there were a lot of other little things that we needed to do. So I was part of the Mystique team at Kleiser Walzak for X-Men 2. That was my first job.
That's cool. And I'm just kind of curious, like, the first feature film you ever get to work on being X-Men 2, like, was that like a fun time for you? Like, oh my God, I'm getting to work on a freaking, big Hollywood Marvel film, or was this kind of like another gig?
Well, it was my first gig, and I was excited. I had liked the first X-Men film, and I mean, you sometimes when you're working on a film, don't you know how you start to get an idea of whether or not the film's going to be any good, Well,
I remember they were working on X-Men 3. I was over in Winnipeg at Frantic, and I wasn't on it, but I kept asking everyone at lunch, like, oh yeah, is it any good? They're like, everyone dies. And it wasn't until I saw the film, like, oh yeah, everyone does die. And like, yeah, it's one of these things where it's like, they're literally just trying to end the franchise with this film.
I was like, I think this is going to be a good film. I certainly had a good time working on it. It was kind of like it was the middle of winter in Western Massachusetts, so there was snow outside. I was there with a couple of friends that I had known from graduate school. They had helped me get hired. And basically we just would hang out during our free time, but most of the time we would just work in the studio. We were working, and then when we weren't working, we were playing video games and, sleeping and, cooking and, none of us
did
had
everything
kids
together.
at that time. Yeah, we were just hanging out. It was like being at visual effects summer camp for film.
That's cool. And I think we talked about this last time. You mentioned initially going to Kleiser Walzak and, again, like the relationship of having people, like friends in the industry. And I think it's like a really critical thing, because I think a lot of people, they have like the kind of iron curtain of like, how do I break into the industry? How do I get through this force field that's keeping me out? And I think a lot of people really need to realize that like relationships are so critical, especially in school and beyond school as well, because usually one or two people are going to go off and get their foot in the door, and then bit by bit, everyone else starts to kind of trickle in through those other people. So relationships are really critical. And for you, you had a few friends who had gone over there, and you kind of ended up coming in through them as well, correct?
Yeah. And I mean, speaking to your, to the people out there who are trying to figure out how to break in, I would say that you kind of need a few components. Number one, you need to know what you're doing. You need to be good, and you have to have a portfolio. But beyond that, exactly like what you were saying, you have to have relationships. So many people say to me, why should I go to college, or why should I pay for school? And don't get me wrong, art education these days, higher level education, very expensive, but it gives you a relationship with a community of people.
Absolutely.
And you gain a reputation among them, and all of those people go out into the world and they get jobs. And then when they are looking to hire, they'll say, hey, I know this person that I went to school with, and they were good, and I worked with them on a school project, and we got along really well, or, whatever. And that's one of the ways it happens. So you got to have, a relationship. You have to have relationships, no question. Mm-hmm. And then you just have to be persistent, because, and then the fourth thing I kind of always say is that you have to have luck. But I think really luck is about persistence, because sooner or later, if you have those other things, if you have relationships and you have a good portfolio and you're not difficult to work with, then it will work out for you.
Absolutely. And even if you are difficult to work with, sadly enough, there's still a few people I'm shocked, like, how are you still alive? But yeah, I think it's really good advice. And you're right about luck. I mean, I think it's more about making yourself available, and that is persistence and just, again, like trying every opportunity, like trying to get out there as much as you can. I remember I was working on Priest back in the day in the Bay Area, and I was working with Mike Janov and all those guys, and there's one of the kids came from Expression, I think it was, and yeah, like he came in, and then naturally, first thing we do is say, do you know anyone else who's good? Because you're trying to look for other people who are kind of more junior level, but can fill in the gaps of like where we need help. And of course, they're going to say, well, here's a list of my buddies, and like naturally, they're all going to come in. I've seen that so many different times that all it takes is one person to get through the door. They're kind of like a Trojan horse, and then they bring in everyone else, and suddenly you've got like 10 Expression kids or Art Institute kids running around the office. And yeah, I mean, it's so critical. I've got mixed feelings about physical colleges these days for visual effects, just because, again, I feel like there is so much content available online that's more immediate that you can kind of pick from. But I think that one of the critical things is, if you're going to a college because you need someone to kind of kick your butt a little bit and have that accountability, then that's critical. And also the networking aspect, because you're going to get the one or two people who do get into the industry, and they're going to pull in a lot of other people with them. So I think that's a really critical aspect.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah. When you go to school, if it's an online school or if it's a physical bricks and mortar school, eventually you build a community of classmates. Now, what always happens is there's always one or two people in the class that are the shiniest apples on the tree. They get picked first. That's kind of what happens. But then they know who the best people in the class are, or maybe not even the shiniest apples. Maybe just sometimes somebody gets first.
Yeah, or they're really outgoing, which not everyone is. So having those people who are willing to, show up to SIGGRAPH and everywhere else and be like, hey, I'm a junior. Here's my reel. Have you looked at my reel yet? Why haven't you looked at my reel?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and then also that's also where being your personality and being reliable and being good at what you do comes into play, because if somebody is recommending you, you are going to be a reflection on them. And if you turn up and you don't work out, that's a reflection on your friend. And your friend is never going to recommend you again because you made them look bad.
Absolutely. I think that, like me personally, I think that's taken me a long time to really realize, because for the longest time, I've always been happy to be like, oh yeah, use me as a reference. And oh yeah, that person's great. And bit by bit, it's... you start to really stop yourself when you're like, oh yeah, I'll recommend someone, and be like, wait a minute, do I know that they're great, or have they been telling me for the last 10 years that they're great? So I think it's really important when you actually work with people, opposed to just be buddies with someone, and you keep hearing from them how talented they are, and then, opposed to seeing it for yourself. So I think it can be kind of critical, because you're right. Like, there's times where you recommend someone and you go out of your way to get someone work, and then they completely, throw that to the wind and mess up. And it reflects back on you as well. So you got to be really careful of that.
Yeah. You do. You have to be careful who you recommend. But then
I can tell that you're like hesitating to tell 100 stories right now, I feel.
Yes. A few stories come to mind that I'm not going to repeat.
But yeah, I mean, if you want, like, let's dive into a few of the. I mean, I feel like there's so much we can talk about that I feel like it might be fun to talk about a few of the projects you've worked on, and kind of move on to the billion other fun things that I'm gonna enjoy chatting to you about. But I mean, after Matrix, what were some of the next couple of projects you jumped into?
Well, so the Matrix. So I was on the Matrix.
Sorry, I meant X-Men, but yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, from X-Men, I went to ESC Entertainment here in California. They were working on the final film of the Matrix trilogy, Matrix Revolutions, and that show was just on fire at the time. They were trying to get it done, and
I've never met anyone who ever, I've had plenty of people defend those projects, but never anyone like say like, oh yeah, it was a dream. It was like, it was a challenge.
It was a lot of hard work. They were burning the midnight oil for sure. And I don't think that mode of working would be sustainable for anybody, but sometimes that's what happens is you get that, productions will get themselves into a situation where they have to work crazy hours.
Yeah.
But that's what the situation was. And they needed people. And I think that that's one of the things that made them willing. And I did have one film credit on my resume. And that's what made them willing to open their doors and take me on. And that got me to the West Coast. And after those two films, I was kind of off to the races. It was, so I did The Matrix. And then from there, I went on to the orphanage to work on Hellboy.
Just to loop back to Matrix for a second, because again, like, You are right. Like, it's those two projects were definitely brutal ones to work on. And do you feel like, having gone through that, you maybe got like 5 years of experience in 2 years or whatever the duration was? Because I definitely think that there are some projects that, you do go through a lot, and the growth that you get, is worth its weight in gold compared to, let's say, going and working on a smaller project where you have less responsibility and there isn't as much pressure. The pressure is usually what kind of pushes you to get the most growth.
I think I would have learned a lot even if I was leaving at the end of the day at 6 p.m.
Well, there's those projects too.
I mean, if you want to, any new job you start at, there's going to be a learning curve. And, when you're working 70-hour weeks, it's a little more painful. But you do learn, or you just don't last. They're not going to keep you around. If you don't work out, if you don't learn quickly,
right.
You're not going to stick around.
Trial by fire. And what was the type of work that you were specifically doing?
So on X-Men 2 and on Matrix Revolutions, I was part of the Roto Paint team on those two shows. So I was doing more, on X-Men 2, I was doing a lot of tracking and roto. But then at ESC on Matrix Revolutions, I started to really do, plate reconstruction and rig and wire removal. And I was starting to learn some basic compositing skills. We were using Shake, and there was an old Roto Paint software called Commodore. Was it Commodore? Yeah. It was.
What was it? Commodore? I know what you're talking about. I think it was Commodore or something very, very similar. That
I can't remember if it was called Commotion.
Commotion. Yes. Okay. That was the first time I ever used any tracking software. Was in Commotion. It had a really good tracker.
It did have a good tracker.
Yeah.
It was buggy, but it did have a good tracker. So yeah. And then I was learning how to do doing procedural paint techniques, tracking in patches, corner pinning. That kind of stuff, basic compositing skills.
That's cool. And then you went off to the O from that point?
Yeah, okay. So here's a funny little story about getting hired at the orphanage. The person they were on fire with Hellboy, and they needed people. And I think that, ESC was, kind of letting people go. And so the orphanage was eager to pick up some talent. And I think that they confused me with a more senior paint artist from ESC who did not ultimately take the job at the orphanage. I think that they thought that I was her somehow because they bring me in, they put me in an office instead of, in the sliver where all the people sat together. And the first day they just give me this incredibly hard paint shot. And I was like, oh my God. And I just kind of said, yeah, I can do that. I kind of swallowed my fear and said, oh yeah, I can do that. And, called a friend on the phone. Okay, I need to track this thing. And, what do you think? How would you approach this? And, got to know some of the artists there, and you just kind of muddle your way through it. Sometimes you have to kind of jump into the pool in the deep end and be a little over your head sometimes in order to stretch your skills.
So how'd it work out?
I got it done. I had a little help from a compositor, but I did end up getting it done. So
cool. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, I nearly went to work on that because I was just going back to Australia in 2004, and like Dagan and Michael Spohr and all those guys were all trying to get me to jump on it. So I ended up like answering a few questions, over the internet back in Australia at the time. But yeah, it seemed like it was a really amazing team at the time, working on that and Day After Tomorrow and a couple other projects that we're doing in 2004. So I mean, again, like the orphanage being like, a couple doors down essentially from ILM and being a small Max house at the time, doing, Max and Maya, but doing all this amazing stuff. Like I think would have been a fun time to be there, I'm sure.
The O was certainly going through their growing pains at that time. I think that they really had their hands full with those two movies in a way that they had never been before. I was trying to remember, did we ever work at the orphanage together?
I never worked there. There's so many opportunities to. I was actually thinking about it early today for a different reason, but yeah, I basically had a bunch of chances to go work there, and it was just really bad timing every single time. But it meant that when I finally did go on to help out with the Spy guys on Priest, I remember the interview was pretty much like, look, we've been trying to hire you for 10 years, so it's more about do you want the job or not? And that's when I was like, well, what bars are around here? This is 2nd Street next to the stadium. And that's when Janov was like, well, there's, was it 21st Amendment or whatever, and there's this one and that, and then he's like, do you like scotch? Do you want to go right now? So I was like, all right, okay, clearly I've got the negotiation power here if they're like trying to push me to go to the bar with them right now to get drunk. But yeah, so I never worked with them, but always stayed in touch because I was always keen to, because like Iron Man and all the other projects that were going through there at the time.
Yeah. Yes. Because I think that you and I never were in the same facility until we were both at ILM, now that I think about it.
Fun times, but you were on Dirt at the time.
Oh, yeah. I was on Rango, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, yes, by then I was doing cameras, and I was doing camera layout and camera match move, and that was definitely a lot more fun than Roto Paint. Not to say that Roto Paint is not worthy of respect, because it is. But yes, I was doing camera layout on Rango, and that was super fun. And that was really what I wanted to, get into. Was I just love the visual storytelling aspect of layout. That is really, so much of a film happens with the camera and with editing. And, the longer I learn about movies and watch movies, the more I really appreciate cameras and how stories are told with the camera. And that is a really exciting thing. And working on that show really taught me a lot about the importance of the good use of the camera. So
I think it's a pretty, I know we're jumping around a bit, but I think that for me, cameras is something I never really got into until I started working more in set and getting more interested in shooting myself. But at the same time, like I feel like if you are to get more into cameras or into previs, a lot of people don't realize that you actually get a lot more creative control than most areas of CG. Anywhere else, you're more in that reactive mode of creating whatever they desire, but here's a chance where you actually get to put some creative input in yourself. You get to say, hey, well, what if we make it a wider lens? What if we have a bit more stuff going on in the background? Why don't we make the shot a bit more interesting? I tried these other ideas out, like let's see what you guys think of this and that. So I think that is like a really cool benefit of being involved earlier in the production of something as pivotal as doing camera work, for sure.
Oh yeah, well, and I certainly learned that directors care about cameras a lot. They Gore Verbinski was really involved in the cameras on that show. Yeah, it's absolutely true that the camera gives you a lot more creative control. And that's certainly something to think about, I would say, for if there's anybody listening who's interested in getting into visual effects. You do need to consider that in the visual effects pipeline, there's kind of a couple of different kinds of roles. Some roles are what I like to call shot-based, like animation is shot-based, compositing is shot-based, lighting is shot-based. So like it's all about getting shots done. But then other disciplines are asset-based. So things like modeling and shading creatures or sets are asset-based. For effects, I would say maybe it's more shot based.
It's pretty much shot based. You can have that foresight of saying, well, let's build assets ahead of time, but in the long run, you're gonna have your hero effects, and you might have like background stuff. But yeah, it's as much as you want to plan ahead, it never works out as well as like, oh yeah, we'll just do it all ahead of time, and then we don't have to worry about it. It never works out that way.
Yeah, and I mean, but I would say that life in terms of lifestyle, my observation has been that. And maybe modelers and shaders will come back and yell at me, but I think that things are not quite as bad when you're in an asset-based department. If you're modeling and shading, life isn't always necessarily quite as hard as it is if you are, doing something like compositing or lighting or animation, where you've just got this massive inventory of shots that you have to plow through. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there are times I just was like, man, I just wish I was just modeling an asset.
Well, yeah, it just depends like where you are in the pipeline. And I always felt like effects and compositing were always at the very end. And so at smaller studios, it's not, unheard of that you end up tweaking an animation shot or something, on the last night of production, just because everyone else in the team's either gone off the project or they've gone on to other projects. And so suddenly effects and compositing is usually the ones who've got to, literally juggle anything that kind of comes through, but in reality, it's lighting, effects, and compositing are the final three. Whereas like modeling, storyboarding, a lot of the stuff usually is at the very beginning. I did work on a project recently where the night before finaling a 600 frame shot, I think it was, we were getting new character assets and new cameras. So I'm glad to see there's still bad habits 20 years later that are still happening that you can shake your head at. But yeah, usually if you look at the pipeline, you can say, well, yeah, earlier on, like I also feel like earlier in the pipeline are more jobs that you're likely to be able to work remotely as well. So modeling and stuff like that, you're more have an opportunity to be able to work from home if you wanted to, whereas it's very unlikely you're going to comp shots from home too often.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely.
As much as a Scarecrow tried to do that a couple of years ago, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people want that, but I think that it's for so many reasons, it just has not worked out being able to have a remote visual effects team for feature films is really tough to wrangle.
Yeah.
So, there's something to be said for if you're having a problem with something, going down the hall to whoever generated that asset and saying, hey, what's up with this thing that you made? And then you say, oh, I'm sorry. When I published that asset,
I was on crack.
Right, or whatever. I just, it's so easy to, people make mistakes. People do think, oh, yes, I'm sorry, I had the world oriented the wrong way or something like that. Things happen. As time has gone on, I've come to the conclusion that if a production has 8 months to get things done, it's going to take 8 months or 8.5 months. If a production has 4 months, it'll take 4.5 months. And if, it will just take as long as there is time. Sometimes there have been a few situations where I've been on really difficult productions, and you'll just look and say, okay, well, when is this movie supposed to be coming out? And you'll look and you'll say, oh my God, it's 10 months away.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of people will say, hey, you shouldn't complain. That's 10 months of work. But it sometimes can be just 10 months of, like, sometimes I think a lot of it is just that it's getting people to make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if they don't make decisions, and I understand, they want to get it right, and they want to, make sure that they've, covered every base to find the best solution to things. But, and sometimes things just, take time, or maybe there were some poor choices made when they shot it. I don't know, but God, I think sometimes, if they know they have the time, they will take that time to make their decisions.
Yeah, you've got Parkinson's law, which is that a task will expand or shrink to fill the necessary time that is assigned to it. And so I've felt like that is like a rule of thumb with visual effects and a lot of things, that you could be making split decisions right then and there that are pretty much going to be spot on, but because you go an extra 3 months, you end up, I feel like you can get to 90% completion on a shot within a couple of days, and then from there it's a month of tweening a shot and revising it when it's probably quite unnecessary. And yeah, I do feel like I've worked on so many productions where in the last 2 weeks we literally redo everything from scratch and we get it all done, and it really came down to just we need to make decisions, and those decisions would have been correct the first time, but we had all that time, and it ends up being like, okay, if this is an 8-month job, as you said, then it's going to be 8.5 or 8 months. It's not going to be like, okay, great, we'll knock it down 2 weeks and then we'll go on vacation, as much as we want it to be.
Absolutely. I didn't know there was actually a name for it, though, because it's absolutely true.
Yeah, I feel like it applies to so many things, but with visual effects, like hands down, I do feel like it really describes to a T like what we go through. And I've had that, like I mentioned Superman before, and like I ended up leaving that job halfway through initially just because we went through that exact thing where we had 6 months of R&D, and then we'll go back into production. And because of that, we got to a point where I needed to go build up all these clouds, and I built up all the clouds for these particular shots. And then the creative feedback was, well, let's now have a camera fly through the clouds. There was no shot that we're going to be doing that required flying through the clouds, but we had all this time, so this was going to be it. And that's where it's just like, look, I can go be busy on 100 other jobs and then come back when this, gets to the stress level that it needs to be. So for me, like, again, working from home, me personally, I like working on multiple jobs at once, and that way you hit render on something, you can switch to something else. Why do I need to babysit something and, play around on the internet when I could be doing things, getting stuff done? And I feel like, again, with visual effects, like you can sit and noodle something for forever and it's not really going to change that much, or you could make a decisive decision at that point and then move on to the next thing. So yeah, some people just have an extended schedule, and it kind of ends up being a negative thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Or the other thing that kind of always gets you in visual effects is that they need to get things out to a certain state, either for the trailer.
Yep, for temps.
Or for temps. Yeah. So what will happen is, I mean, my approach is always, especially more when I work now with cameras, is, the first time you put something out there, it's not what they want. So you kind of just, and if they aren't telling you to begin with, like maybe you don't have great reference, or you don't have, some kind of and you don't have visual reference or something to tell you, okay, this is what we want. So I've just put something out there, because then that will get the conversation going. But man, and 9 times out of 10, it's fine because what will happen is they'll say, no, not that. And then they'll tell you what they want. And that's really what you need. But sometimes they kind of like it. And
the whole time you were talking, I was thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what happens is this poorly cobbled together thing that you just threw together to kind of get the ball rolling they do not want you to deviate from that, but they want you to build on top of it. And oh man, a couple times I've been screwed. I've screwed myself because, it's what you have is kind of fundamentally poorly constructed. Maybe I've built a scene on a really cheaply or poorly matched match move, like a match move that's not really done. And they'll say, we love this move. And then you have to carefully go back and fix all of the stuff that's underpinning everything without ruining the things that they love. And that can always be kind of dangerous. I'm sure you've run into things like that.
I worked with JBot once, and yeah, that was like one of the big things that we're going to pitch, like doing this big CG explosion. And the whole point was like, my whole way of working is that if you go and kind of like what we were just talking about, you go and you make something and they ask for changes, you go and make that change, then you go and make the change again. They keep saying 10% more, 10% more.
Yeah.
And then they come back after the weekend and they're like, oh wait, yeah, now it's too much because they've got fresh eyes. So usually what I do is I'll make something and then I'll make a more subtle version and I'll make a ridiculously stupid one. And that way they can say too much. And that way you've got something you can measure and you can say, okay, whenever they say more, you say, well, remember we entertained that and we had too much. So they're like, oh yeah, you're right. So by having the subtlety and then the extreme and then the one you like, you can usually get to a result that you can final within like 2 or 3 takes. And I just remember making the ridiculously freaking stupid over-the-top explosion, expecting him to be like, oh yeah, that's way too much, but I like where it's going. And it's just like, that's it, I want more of that. And it's just like, wait, you just chose the stupid one. Like, what have we done? Like, this completely backfired. And that happens so much now where you make the ridiculously over-the-top stupid thing expecting to limit everything and they like it. Then it's like, shit.
Totally. I know. I haven't been in that situation very often, but sometimes if that happens, that's maybe only happened a couple times. What I realize is that they actually want something else, and that I'm misunderstanding what they want.
That's cool.
So, but that's how you get there. I think for a long time, another thing that I would do is I would, like they would say, we want this and this and this or whatever, and you make it and they don't like it. And you just shred yourself. You're like, oh, I got it wrong. And after a while, you realize, it's going to be wrong for a long time. So it's not you. It's just the process.
I think that's actually a good thing to talk about for a second. But like, working in iterations and thinking creative direction. I mean, for me, I've mentioned this 100 times, but I worked with a guy back in the day and, he told me this when I was 17, 18. He said, as long as they have the money, I have the time. And for me, that always stuck. And it's always meant that when they come back with the 100th iteration, I mean, part of my job, especially when you go into more of a senior role, is always to help them get to the decision they need to make. But either way, like, I never took it personally and I never was afraid to go back and keep doing it because to me, it's, as long as they have the money, I have the time. This is a job. Whereas I've seen so many people take it personally where I've seen people like physically get restrained because they were trying to run in to yell at the director and tell him that he's ruining the movie because he desaturated or oversaturated their shot or, stupid little things. And I think a lot of us need to realize like we are in a service vendor industry and, we are creating someone else's vision. And at the same time, like we are hired to go and make whatever they want. And if they have changes, then okay, no problem. Like it's clock in, do the work and clock out. It's only when you start physically having to go through like crazy, stupid hours because of poor decisions. And that's, affecting everything else. Like that's when, the overdoing the changes can kind of affect you a lot more.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, this isn't about your personal vision. It can be about something, if maybe you have something special that you bring to the table and you're a specialist in certain things, like you're a specialist in effects. And, but it's really about listening to what people want and, helping them get to get their vision up on the screen. And yeah, it's absolutely true that your job is to listen to your supervisors and to the director or visual effects supervisor and try to give them what they're asking for.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it gets frustrating. Like I can't decide which is worse. There are the times when you're burning and working 80 hours a week, and the production is really in crunch time because you're trying to get a lot done in like 4 weeks, and the film isn't done. So there's that. But then everything does kind of come together and you finish it. But then there's the other circumstance, which is when you have a client, and it's not usually when it's film. It's usually something else, like a corporate client or a ride film, something that does not have the hard finish date of a movie. And they just have the time and the money to noodle stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I agree that it is our job to help them get what they want. But I think sometimes I have experienced clients, working for clients who I think they just kind of they feel like they have a room full of ninjas. And they're telling those ninjas, they're saying, okay, now you guys, I want you to do this. And they don't have a vision of what they want, and they just keep tweaking. And they have money and they have time. If they have plenty of money, like those are the things that can constrain them, are money and time. Eventually they run out of money or they run out of time. And that's often how projects get finished.
That's right.
And the painful thing is when you're doing iteration number 172, and it's just, you're just doing these tiny tweaks, or they all of a sudden a client will decide they want to go down a rabbit hole. Well, what if we're on the other side of the room now?
I did 140 takes of a shot of bird poop for Disney once. And literally got to a point where I had the most complicated rig. It was 1 million polygons, had birdseed, had like iridescent bits of green and brown, and I've never seen a shot like to this day get noodled as much as that. And without the handles and everything, it literally is split second and it's gone. And I remember going to the premiere and I was just like, that's it. Like I worked on 30 shots at least for that show, but that one shot always ZZ07. I can still remember. This is 2001, but you know the shot codes that stick with you for the rest of your life, you know?
Oh yes. And you look at it and it's on screen for like a fraction of a second. And
that's right.
You say to yourself, that was a month of my life.
Yeah, that was my marriage or whatever, you know, things you went through because of those shots that you bled out for. And I guess it's an interesting thing is like the amount of like visual effects is definitely a brutal industry, and you know there are projects that you just see the amount of we don't need to go down that route, but like the amount of personal lives that kind of go up in flames because of the sacrifices you put in for, you know, the crazy schedules that we have. And
I mean, it's definitely, that is really one of the downsides of visual effects, is that if you let it will consume your life. And when I was younger, I was happy to let visual effects consume my life.
It's fun.
It is fun.
Doing all-nighters, like I've done 3 days in a row without sleep. I haven't been home. I'm wearing the company shirts now that I get from the closet. That's something you're proud of. And then when, you know, you're a bit older, it's just like, F this, I've got a life, you know, I've got family, I've got people, you know, depending on me. And you know, I wasn't planning to go into that whole area, but I mean, at the same time, like, I think both of us being in the industry for so long, it is kind of interesting to see that shift where you got the younger people who are kind of like so excited that they get to do an all-nighter, and then later you kind of have that mindset shift.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I think that it's fun to go through that, but it's not sustainable for anybody. No. And I kind of push back against any culture, any studio culture that kind of says that, you know, if you're not here at 9 p.m. all the time, you're doing it wrong. You're unacceptable. And
you're not one of the team.
Yeah, and that's bad planning from my point of view.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's not sustainable in the long term. You know, when you're young, sure, but do you really want to do that for the rest of your life? Is that what your entire life is going to be about? I don't think so. Yeah,
I think it's really valid. And like, even when I was younger, I was probably 19. That was something that kind of affected me a little bit. Was just thinking about the the decision making of certain people on a project who are managing it, how the repercussions don't affect them, but they affect everyone else. So in other words, someone makes poor decisions, suddenly it's everyone else who's having to work late and work the weekends and, all that kind of crazy stuff. I wrote an article a long time ago called Overtime versus Productivity, and that was more around that subject of the fact that, all the unnecessary requirements of people having to work crazy hours and thinking, hey, if I make everyone work an extra 4 hours every night for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to get, all this free work out of them, or I'm going to get ahead on the job, and not realizing that in the long run, the amount of mistakes people make, all the resentment, all the ripples that happen from burning people out, it's not worth it in the long run. But what's interesting is that I think that there's still a bit of responsibility on the artist end too, where just because we're being told we got to work crazy hours, it's still our decision if we want to end up playing video games at 4 p.m. every day with everyone else, or go for those extended 2-hour lunch breaks with everyone and, come in at 11 instead of 10. All those things add up. So when you're frustrated that I got told I got to work back late tonight, when if you measure the amount of work you're doing, there is certain places that are a bit more lenient on managing, what artists do day to day, and there is all that free time that they end up hanging out at other people's desks and doing everything else too. So I think it is really critical that all of us do become as optimal with when I'm at my desk, I'm going to work, I'm going to get my shots done, communicate where everything's at, and that way hopefully you can kind of limit the amount of overtime you end up having to do, hopefully.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's you definitely, I'm all about working smart and not hard. You hear that phrase all the time. And I mean, sometimes you have to,
I work hard, not smart.
Sometimes, I don't know, Alan, but sometimes I think you care about being efficient and getting things done, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think that I think what happens is that, number one, as when you start out young, you kind of need to learn how to build good work habits. And that's sometimes hard to do when you have all this time. And number two is that when you are really pressed hard into a lot of overtime for an extended period of time, I think what ends up happening, you were talking about long lunches or goofing off in the office, playing video games and stuff. I think that what ends up happening is that people reach a saturation point. And if they're kind of expected because of company culture to be around for to just kind of show their face at a certain hour of the day, if they're putting in 10, 12-hour days, they're not working all of that time, because I think that what ends up happening is they have to blow off some steam. And what's better is if you do sit down and you're focused and you get an iteration out, or you reach a certain level of completion on whatever it is that you're working on. And then you have to step away and let someone else look at it, or just take a break. There's a law of diminishing returns when it comes to doing this stuff and doing anything really.
Absolutely.
No,
I think it's so true. And that goes back to, what I was saying earlier about the managers and the people managing the teams. If they think that, okay, if I burn people out and I get everyone to work 15-hour, 20-hour days, that this is going to be a really well-running machine. And it's not, because you're right. You do get artists who end up resenting their job and saying, well, I'm going to be here all night anyway, who cares? And I'm just going to hit render and go to lunch. And it is because you need to kind of create your own buffer just to, prevent yourself from burning out. And that's where I feel the manager needs to do a better job of just, being able to say to someone hey, you need to take a break, or, hey, everyone, look, we've hit, what we need to get done. Why kill ourselves for another weekend? Have time off, and because I always think back to those times when you leave at 2 a.m, you go home, and then you're back at 9 a.m, and it literally feels like you walked out of the building, turned around, and came back in. You don't even feel like you went home or you slept or anything, and that's really depressing when you get that point. I can't believe we're going down this really negative VFX is the end of the world thing, but I mean, it is kind of a valid thing that as fun and as rewarding as visual effects is, there's obviously the reality is that it is so much work, and you can be on a job for years sometimes. just to get one feature film out. It's a big journey.
Well, I mean, there can be something rewarding about pushing yourself from time to time.
Yep.
If the overtime is well warranted, if somebody comes and they say, listen, we need you to work a Saturday, or we need you guys to do some overtime for the next couple of weeks just to kind of push this thing over the edge and make it look awesome.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it is worthwhile. The thing that is, I think, kind of abusive is when they come to you and they say, we need you to do 65-hour weeks for the next 3 months. That's somebody else, like you were saying before. It's me paying for someone else's bad decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over time, it's very difficult not to resent that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I don't think visual effects needs to be that way.
Okay, again, I want to thank Kat for taking time out to chat, and this is, like I said, the last episode for now. As I mentioned, this was a very long episode that we decided to break up, and I think this episode was really cool. I'm excited to get into the next episode because it's another one that I broke up into two, which was with Ivo Klaus, one of the VFX supervisors for Scanline. And again, just because I wanted these to be super specific, I'm trying to keep them a little bit shorter and a little bit more focused these days. As obviously in the past, there's been some very lengthy ones where we get into a lot, but if you're looking for specific content, it's kind of hard to have to sift through a lot to get to that. So that's why I like the idea of kind of keeping them a bit more focused. So next episode is kind of part 2 of my discussion with Ivo Klaus, who's one of the soups at Scanline VFX. And we get into discussing his whole history, which is entirely at Scanline, a lot of the behind the scenes on the film productions that he's worked on, and a lot of other really cool stuff. So that episode will be up next, episode 143. Until then, check out the show notes, almackay.com/142, and I'll link in there to the free training that I'm putting out right now as well. Okay, so that is it for now. Rock on.